We are delighted to welcome you to the third night of our Vacation Bible School. We're studying the flood. We're having a great school, and we have enjoyed having B.J. Clarke with us to teach this adult class. And you will be glad you came tonight or you tuned in. We're grateful to have all of you with us. So tonight, as we study about the flood, B.J. Clarke, Director of Memphis School of Preaching.
Wish you a good evening. So glad to be with you tonight and so glad to continue our study of the Word of God. Think about it. Something that happened all those years ago has occupied our attention all week long and will continue to do so, and still is relevant today, no matter how far we think we've gone from the beginning of time. Truth is, the more things change, the more they stay the same, and you see a lot of attitudes in the early days of the Bible that you still see today. And so this is perpetually relevant. And as we continue now our study of the overall theme of the flood, we are reminded tonight of the ark itself and the role that it plays in the salvation of mankind. I want to put this question before you as we begin tonight and have it just circulating through your mind throughout the study tonight. How many locations for salvation did God have during the time of the flood? How many locations for salvation did God have available to mankind during the flood that we read about in the book of Genesis? Now, when it comes to the subject of the ark, there's a passage in the book of Psalms 111 and verse 2, which speaks of the fact that the works of the Lord are great, studied by all who have pleasure in them. And this is true of all kinds of fields of study. God is certainly so brilliant and beyond anything we can comprehend. He is above us. And we can certainly understand when we look at the design and the complexity of the human body alone, and you just study it. And if you let yourself stop and think about it, think about all the miles of circulatory system that are wrapped up inside of your body that are doing their work. Think about the fact that you're breathing and not even having to think about the fact that you're breathing. It just happens as your brain continues to send the signals forth. There's no one in this room, surely, who believes something like this could happen by accidental chance and happenstance. We carry around phones that we would never in a million years believe just kaboomed into existence. Fortunately for us, all the parts necessary for the making of a cell phone kaboomed and collided in the air, and when they landed, so far so good, they landed in just such a fashion as to produce the phone. No designer, no intelligence behind it. It's all random chance and happenstance. Who in this room tonight would believe such? We know better. And so when it comes to knowing how things work and knowing how to construct things and build things, I think God certainly knows how to build things. The universe itself is what He built. And think about the intricate design that's involved in the building of the universe, and how the planets do not run into one another, and how the sun is right where it needs to be, too close and we'd burn up, too far away and we'd freeze to death. All those things make us have confidence in the fact that God knew how to save mankind from the flood that was coming. And I want you to notice the design of the salvation location. This is the design of the salvation location. Go to Genesis chapter 6 in your copy of the Word of God, if you will. Genesis chapter 6, and you'll note here that when God tells Noah in verse 13 that because man had so corrupted himself that God was going to have to destroy the world with a flood, I'm reminded of the fact that you can drive by and see a beautiful house, or at least a house that used to be beautiful. and now it is in dilapidated condition. When it was first made, it was so good. And over time, the ravages of time and neglect, and perhaps even deliberate misuse of the property, has led to this state of affairs where the boards are rotting and the foundation is cracked and everything is just out of sorts. And it's gotten to the point now, there's no remodeling and reshaping it because you can't carve or shape rotten wood. There comes a point in time when you have to start over with new materials. Fortunately for the human race, there was Noah and his family who found grace in the eyes of the Lord, but the rest of mankind was rotting from the inside, so to speak, spiritually corrupt, and there was a need to start over. And God didn't make this hair-trigger decision just overnight. He sent a preacher, Noah, to beg and to plead. Enoch before him had preached and warned and pleaded, and now it's time for the end of all flesh to come. Verse 13, the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Now watch verse 14. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Room shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. It's a tar-like substance that provides a sealant. And he says, this is the fashion which thou shalt make it of. The length of the ark shall be whatever you think best, Noah. That's not what your Bible says, and it's not what God said. God told Noah exactly how long to make the ark. And God told Noah exactly how broad to make the ark, 50 cubits. And God also told him just how high he wanted it, 30 cubits. And in fact, he said in verse 16, I want a window in the ark. I want it to be a cubit. Within a cubit from the top there of the above section of the ark, you shall finish it in a cubit above, and the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof. And then God even specified the number of stories on the ark. A lower story, a second story, and a third story shalt thou make it. Now, when you look at the design of the ark that we've just seen here in Genesis 6:14 to 16, you see a number of things that start to become apparent to us. Number one, you'll note the ark was to be constructed of gopher wood. Now, this is interesting because no one today can seem to absolutely pinpoint the kind of wood that this would have been, but certainly Noah knew what kind of wood was gopher wood. And there was something about it that God chose it to be the wood. He did not just say, Noah, I tell you what, I want you to build an ark and build it out of wood. If God had said build it out of wood and had been that generic, then Noah would have been permitted to use anything that was wood. But when God gets specific, man has to obey specifically. And when God says, I want it to be gopher wood, he doesn't have to say, and thou shalt not build it out of oak or poplar, and thou shalt not build it out of elm, thou shalt not build it out of this, that, or the other. When God says gopher wood, guess what that means? I used the illustration last evening, I think it was, that when you order off of a menu, you don't tell the waiter or waitress all the things on the menu you don't want them to bring you. You tell them what you want, and that excludes the other things. When God said gopher wood, that became the only divinely authorized wood in the world. It was the wood of God's choice. It wasn't a matter of man's choosing. God chose the wood, and man is obligated to obey. Now God says, I want this ark to be 300 cubits long. I want it to be 50 cubits wide, and I want it to be 30 cubits high. Now, if you're using what they typically used for a cubit, 18 inches, they would generally measure the length from the elbow to the top of the finger, and they would say that that would be the cubit. And generally, you're looking around 18 inches. Although, as we're going to note here a little bit later, there was another cubit size that was sometimes used. And the Bible here does not specify exactly the dimensions of the cubit in Noah's day, but certainly he knew what a cubit was. And there was a way to measure what God wanted and to make sure it was according to what God wanted. If I told you today to make something 2 feet long, you have a ruler, a stick, or a measuring system by which you can determine whether you have made it 2 feet long or not. If I tell you 3 feet long, that's easy. Go get you a yardstick, put the yardstick down on the ground, and there, okay, now we have the 3 foot limit. And we're not going to go beyond it. We're not going to go under it. We're going to make it exactly as God has specified. So those are inches and feet for us today, but the cubit was the means whereby they would have built the ark, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Now, if you translate that into feet, if you're using an 18-inch cubit, then you're talking about an ark size of 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. That is what you're talking about if that's the case. 3 decks with an unspecified number of rooms, as long as it was 3 stories, it was within God's command, covered inside and out with pitch. This would be, as I said, a tar-like substance that would provide a sealant. There was to be a door in the side. 1 door is specified. There's one way to get into this ark and one way to get out of it as far as the door is concerned. That's the entrance in the side. There is one opening or window section at the top of the ark that is about the length of a cubit between the top of the ark, the window, and then where the ark continues. And so it's very likely that this opening at the top went around the length of the ark, but it still constituted one opening or one window into the ark as far as letting the light in. And then notice Genesis chapter 8. We didn't read this a moment ago, but I'd like to notice it with you. In Genesis 8:13, we get additional information about the way this ark was constructed. Now remember, Noah was 600 years old when he got on board the ark. And now when the ark has come to rest, he's in his 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month. That's when the waters were dried up off the earth. Noah removed, notice, the covering of the ark, and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. And so here is an indication that the ark had some covering that could be removed and would allow for Noah to look outside of it and to see what was going on below on the ground. This is an artist rendering, or just a crude sketch, you might say, of the length of the ark. 300 cubits long, 450 feet. And then when you're talking about the width of it, 50 cubits, which equals 75 feet wide. And then when you're talking about the height of it, from the very bottom to the very top, from the very bottom to the very top, we're talking about 45 feet, which is 30 cubits roughly. And so that is the way the ark was to be constructed. Now here's some other relevant facts to consider. Considering the longevity of men and how long they lived at that time before the flood came, there was plenty of time for an individual to be able to learn a craft and to even master that craft. And the longer one lived and the more mental acuity one would have, with better health and vitality, would allow for the building of such a sizable project. Also, we know this, even before the days that Noah was told to build the ark. If you'll go to Genesis 4, we get an indication that there were already individuals who had learned the craft of working with metal tools and hardware. In Genesis 4:22, it mentions Zillah. She also bare Tubal-Cain, who was, notice, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. And so the ability to work with these metals was already in place prior to the time of Noah being told to build the ark. And so this idea that some people have that men couldn't build something that gigantic back then in that day and time without big power tools and big equipment, they couldn't have done it, we're told by some. And yet they were already working with metal tools and hardware. Plus, they had plenty of time with which to get this job done. Look at Genesis chapter 5 and verse 32. Noah is, as of Genesis 5:32, is said to be 500 years old. We're also told that at some point in time, Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we're told also in chapter 6 and verse 3 that the Lord said, "My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his day shall be." There was a point in time at which God had determined the limits of man's longevity prior to the flood coming, and he said 120 years. And so this didn't have to be built in a month. It didn't have to be built in 6 months. There was plenty of time for the building of this ark. And notice in Genesis chapter 7 and verse 11, the Bible says, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, 2nd month of his 600th year, 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened." And in the Hebrew text, there's something to indicate this as something that is initially happening. And so this is something that had not happened before. This is indeed a catastrophic event when it comes to the fountains of the great deep being broken up, and water came not just from the sky above. Some people don't understand that when it comes to the flood, it's not just water coming from above in the form of rain, 40 days and 40 nights of that we read about in verse 12 initially, but it's much more water than you can imagine even coming from the sky above. There's also water coming up from the earth beneath and causing this flood to take place. Now, Japheth, this is important to know because sometimes people say, well, if Noah's 500 when we read Genesis 5:32, and he is 600 when he enters the ark, then how do you get 120 years crammed into 100 years? But we don't know the exact time that Noah was first told about some of these things. And notice, if you will, first of all, Genesis chapter 9 and verse 24. The Bible tells us in Genesis 9 and verse 24 that Noah awoke from his wine, and then note this, knew what his younger son had done unto him. And notice verse 23 mentions Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were backward so that they wouldn't see their father's nakedness. But he awoke, and Ham, of course, is listed there in this passage as well in verse 22 as the one who saw his nakedness and then told his two brothers about it, and his two brothers were respectful enough to try to go and cover him up without any humiliating exposure. And so Noah awoke and knew what his younger son, Ham would have been a younger son, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, but Ham is the younger. And if you go to Genesis chapter 10, if you will, and notice verse 21, Genesis 10 and verse 21, it mentions unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth, and then notice Japheth is called the elder. And so even though we say Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and we sometimes think that must be in the order of age, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, when I was growing up, known as Brad, Brian, and Brooke. I'm the oldest, my brother's the middle child, my sister's the youngest, and we get in the habit of oftentimes listing our children off by age, but that's not always the way it was done in Scripture. And so Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Japheth is actually the older that we read about here in this text. So we don't know exactly at what point God first communicated with Noah. I can tell you this, as we've already alluded, Noah's great-grandfather Enoch was aware of a coming judgment from God, and certainly that would have been known to his descendants by those who would listen to what he said before God took him from this earth. Here's another thing to remember. In Genesis chapter 5 and verse number 30, we know about Noah's wife, we know about Noah's sons and their wives, or a total of 8 souls aboard the ark. But if you go back to Genesis 5 and verse 30, you remember, in fact, pick up verse 28, that'd be even better. Lamech lived 182 years and begat a son. He called his name Noah, saying, this same, why did you name him that? This same son shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands because of the ground which the Lord had cursed. And Lamech lived after he begat Noah 595 years and begat sons and daughters. And so Noah was not the only child of Lamech. There were sons and daughters of Lamech, which would have been brothers and sisters of Noah, as we read in Genesis chapter 5 and verse 30. And you can't help but reflect on that and think about how many souls ended up getting on board the ark with Noah. 8 souls altogether, counting Noah. Certainly, based on what we read in the text, there would have been family members of Noah himself that are not represented as being aboard the ark, or descendants of family members of Noah's brothers and sisters. None of them were on board the ark. Just Noah, his wife, his boys, and their wives. That's it. 8 souls. And that's something to contemplate. Now, we have some skeptics. Of course, the Bible is always going to have those who deny its power and its origination from the mind of God. Here's the objection that skeptics have offered. Number one, they say, come on. You don't really believe that unintelligent, incapable amateurs build a seaworthy vessel of that size in that amount of time, do you? And I absolutely believe it. I'll tell you, one of the problems they have in asking a question like that is that when they say unintelligent and incapable, this is their view of man early on, which is not the biblical view. They have man slowly but surely morphing from an ape-like creature until he goes from being hunched over like an ape with a tail, and eventually over the evolutionary span of time became an upright walking individual. And you can see even his tools developed and evolved as well. And so man must have done the same, and therefore we go from an ape-like unintelligent man to an upright man who's now got it together pretty well. That is not the biblical teaching. In fact, you can know that based on Genesis 4, and this is prior to the ark's construction in Genesis 6 and thereafter, you can know from Genesis chapter 4 that civilizations were being constructed. Go to Genesis 4 and look at verse 17. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, and he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. And so you see this building of cities that was taking place and even naming them after individuals. You can also read back in the early part of Genesis chapter 4, agricultural ability was a well-developed thing. The Bible says she again bare Abel, and Abel was a keeper of sheep. Well, who taught him how to do that? Certainly he learned, perhaps by experience and trial and error, but also remember that God was making known things on an as-needed basis and allowing man to discover things by his own experience and work, and knowledge would grow and grow. Cain is a tiller of the ground, and so this is something that required intelligence and ability. And then note here in verse 21, they'd already by this time developed and built musical instruments. Jubal is listed here as the father of all such as handle the harp that is, and the organ. And when you read the word organ in the King James Version, of course, you don't have to think of one you plug in. There were musical instruments that were being built and constructed. As we've already noted, bronze and metal were being worked in Genesis chapter 4 and verse number 22. And so there was lots of intelligence already in the world. And as far as amateurs are concerned, let's talk about shipbuilding for just a moment. It's not impossible, and I can't say beyond a shadow of a doubt, because the Bible does not say, and I won't say what the Bible does not say with the same dogmatism that I can say what it does say. But I know this, you can put some circumstantial evidence together to suggest that there would have been boats constructed, at least the possibility of boats being constructed, before the ark ever was. Go to Genesis 2 and verse 10, and note here that a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from that location it was parted into 4 heads, and then the name of those 4 extensions of that river, those 4 heads of the river, are given in verses 11 to 14. And so these rivers were known. And it's interesting, there were even statements made about what could be found in the land that was right by those rivers. How did man know that if you went up the river, you'd find that there was gold there in verse 11? And how did they know about the bdellium and the onyx stone in verse 12? And when it came to the verse 13, the second river named Gihon, the same as that the river that compasses the whole land of Ethiopia. Well, certainly God could have revealed it by inspiration and did so, and Moses wrote it down, but also there were things that men were learning as they traveled from one location to another. The name of the third river in verse 14 is Hiddekel, that is, it which goeth toward the east of Assyria. The fourth river is the Euphrates, a well-known river in the land of Mesopotamia, which is the land between the rivers. And so there's more than one indication that man could have traveled the waters of his day and perhaps had made boats. Now, I'm not suggesting they were made the size of the ark or anything even close, but there's no evidence that man did not have the ability to navigate the waters prior to the ark, because look at Genesis 1:28. God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea. Well, how are you going to get to those fish? I guess you could fish from the bank all the time, but you're going to not be able to catch some of the fish by the bank that you could in other locations at certain times and places. And so there was certainly the possibility that they would have been able to navigate themselves out onto the water. And so this idea that, well, they couldn't build boats back then. Well, you don't know that. I don't know that as well. Pre-flood shipwrights perhaps could have been more accomplished in their day and time than rather than less, because look how long they lived. They would have been able to have a lot of time to perfect their craft. And it's not impossible, although I would not say that it was a certainty or even a likelihood, but it's not impossible that Noah could have been exposed to shipbuilding by trade or by experience, but I don't need for that to be the case, because Noah could have gotten certainly some information from those who already knew how to build boats. But here's the number one thing, and this is really all that matters. With God on his side and God knowing how long to make the boat, how broad to make the boat, how high to make the boat, God never asks man to do what he wants him to do without providing with the proper knowledge and ability to do so. And so mark it down, God could have communicated to Noah all that he needed to know in order to build a ship of this size. And so I have no problem with it at all. I will tell you that I would highly recommend a visit, if you have not already made one, to the Ark Encounter that is up in Kentucky and up near the Cincinnati, Ohio area. It's still in Kentucky, I believe, but on the way to the Ohio area. And I liked so many things about that visit. I liked being able to see what the size of the ark likely would have been, or something that approximates that size to a very accurate degree. And I liked seeing just how much space there was on the inside of that ark, and that helps take away any arguments from people that said, oh, there wouldn't have been enough room on the ark for the animals, and there wouldn't have been this, there wouldn't have been that. I like so many things about that trip, but the one thing I did not like at all, and if I ever slow myself down, I may write them a letter about it and say, look, I think you're shooting yourself in the foot on this one. On one of the floors there of the Ark exhibit, they have what they call artistic license, their clever way of saying, we decided not only to say that Noah had a wife, and not only that Shem, Ham, and Japheth had wives, we decided to give them names and backstories. And so Noah's wife, Emzara, E-M-Z-A-R-A, you don't find that anywhere in the Bible. There's no indication that was her name or anything. And you don't know the names of any of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. You don't know the names of the wives of those boys. And friends, I'm going to tell you, here's what troubles me. If you're allowed to start making up backstories for the people that were aboard the ark that aren't rooted in biblical truth, you know what the skeptic's going to come along and claim and say? Well, how do we know the rest of this isn't all made up too? Friends, we don't need to go to, in fact, I found it a little bit ironic. They have one of the best exhibits, I think, in the Ark Encounter, is showing you all these children's books that are so inaccurate in the way that they depict Noah and Noah's Ark. And they have a whole display to show you just how wrong those are and how they're not rooted in what the Bible actually says. But then just a floor later, or just a few feet from there, you can go up and find a whole bunch of, for example, they say Noah went to shipbuilding school. Can you show me that in the book of Genesis, please, where Noah went to shipbuilding school? I'd like to see that. Where is that? There's no evidence that Noah needed to go to shipbuilding school. If God wanted him to build the ark, and he did, then God could school him on his own as to what needed to be done. I'm not suggesting it's impossible that he could have gotten training, but I'm telling you that there's no reason to come right out and suggest that we see him and his wife doing this, and oh, this son, he liked more working with the agriculture, and this other son, he was more into this. And the Bible doesn't say any of those things. Why not just leave the good qualities of that ark that are based on what the Bible actually says, leave them as the main thing and leave that other stuff out? What do you think? Be that as it may, I want you to notice the question about whether it's seaworthy. Well, This is a picture of the Wyoming. The Wyoming was built with long wooden planks, built in 1909. As a matter of fact, it was a large wooden ship. There's no evidence it was built with gopher wood, because man has no absolute knowledge of what that wood was and whether it's available today and where you would find it. So it wasn't built out of the same material necessarily as the ark, but it was built with long wooden planks. But here's what happened in 1924, after it had been seaworthy for a number of years. The long wooden planks started torquing and twisting over the course of use, and they started buckling, and the Wyoming actually sank in 1924 because of those long wooden planks buckling. And the argument from the skeptic is, look, the ark is even larger, and if wooden planks wouldn't serve the Wyoming well and would cause it to sink, then you can't say that long wooden planks wouldn't have caused the ark to do the same thing. So they claim that there's no way the Ark of Noah's day could have survived the flood with long wooden planks. The Wyoming proves that. Well, there's several things that we need to consider about this. Number one, the Wyoming was not parallel to the Ark in the first place. Would you notice 6 enormous masts and several sails? You see the sails and things of that nature? This is not the way the ark was built. It didn't need sails. The ark did not have a destination per se. Now, the wind filling those sails on the Wyoming would have caused the torque and the tension to be created by twisting and turning and buckling and the leakage that would have come from that. But the ark wasn't a ship that needed sails to be able to speed up or go to a certain destination and to aim at a certain place. No, it was just needed to float, and God would land it where he would. And that's exactly what happened. And by the way, the Wyoming was able to ship successfully, to sail successfully as a ship for a number of years without any incident. And so it's not something that, and the ark didn't need to sail for years, it just needed to work for the year approximately that men were aboard. And so here's another thing though. They found an Egyptian vessel, and they found that there were the joint system for the way this thing was built. And this is ancient Egypt. The way that this is about 2,000 years BC. And so this is getting back to a time approximating the time just about 500 years after the flood would have likely been. So this is a joint system that they found that is much less affected by the torquing, and thus the wooden planks don't have the twisting and the buckling that goes on. Now, if men could figure out a better way to do it so that the buckling wouldn't happen, do you think God might be able to figure it out? Friends, I want to ask you, does God know how to build and or seal a vessel to make sure it floats and doesn't sink? Does God know how to do that? Go to Genesis chapter 7 and verse 13 and verse 16 rather, and don't miss this absolutely crucial point. They went in, and they went in male and female of all flesh as God had commanded him, and watch, the Lord shut him in. If God shut man in that ark, I can guarantee you he shut him in there securely and safely. God would never ask Noah to enter an ark that he knew was not seaworthy for what was coming. God knew the nature of the flood that was coming, and no, it was not a local flood, as we're going to talk even more about in the next couple of nights, especially the last night. Look, if we're talking local flood, you don't need to build an ark. Just migrate. Just get your family and walk to the place where the flood won't be, and you'll be fine, Noah. But the fact that Noah was told to build an ark is proof that water was going to be where? Everywhere. And incidentally, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but I want to say it for the sake of those who may or may not be able to return later this week. Here's something else to consider. You remember that God promised there'd never be a flood like the one that happened in Noah's day again? If it's a local flood in Noah's day, tell me, have there ever been any local floods since the days of Noah, yes or no? So did God break his promise? No. There has never been a flood like the one that we're talking about and reading about in the book of Genesis. That's just a fictional thing, but it helps illustrate my point. Someone in this story says that a man died in a flood, a local flood, and he went to heaven, and he said, God, I would like to address all of the people here in heaven about how bad this flood was that I just died in. I want them to know just what it's like to go through a flood like that. And God said to him, you may speak to the audience, that's fine, but just remember Noah's going to be in the audience. The point being, there's never been a flood like the flood Noah saw and survived and lived through. And yes, God knows how to build and seal a vessel. We trust God. But was there enough time to build an ark of that size? I mean, we're talking about Noah. Okay, let's take Noah by himself. If Noah had worked alone, then in 120 years, we're talking about approximately 300,000 working hours. But there's no indication that God said, Noah, you're the only hands that I'm going to allow to touch this ark. There's every indication that Noah would have involved his family, certainly Noah and his 3 sons. If you take Noah plus his 3 sons, then you've got 900,000 working hours available for the project to meet the time and deadline. But what if you add, for the sake of illustration, his sons and all 4 wives, Noah's wife and the wives of the 3 boys? Could they not do some things? They may not have been able to handle every part of the project, but is there nothing they could have done to help build the, I guarantee you, they would know better to do how to build than I would. Look, it's embarrassing to me, but my mom and dad bought my wife a tool set for Christmas some years ago. They bought it for her because they knew I wouldn't know what to do with it. My wife, when we got married, her dad was a Mr. Fix-It. My dad was a Mr. Fix-It, and she knew that about both men. Assumed that would be true of me as well. I am his son, after all. So she came to me when we were first married, and she says, we need a new shower head in the bathroom, in the bathtub, there in the shower. I said, okay. I went and got me a hammer, and I went in there, and I was determined that we were going to get a new shower head, and when that one wouldn't twist off like I wanted it to, I gave it a couple of raps, and it came off, in my hand, with pipe still attached to it. And my wife, when I walked out and showed it to her, told me later, she said, I knew then you were not the man my father was or that your dad was. No, I'm not. So wives are great builders too. There's no reason to say that Noah's wives, his wife and his 3 sons and their wives, I should say, that they couldn't have, and if they did, if they all got involved, we're now looking at 1.8 million working hours available. So how long did it take to build the Ark Encounter? The ark that's there at the Ark Encounter in Kentucky? 280,000 working hours. That's how long it took to build it. And that's not nearly as long as Noah had. He had more than enough time to build the ark God wanted built, and there's no reason to deny that. Oh, here's another objection, though. How are you going to fit millions of animal species on the ark? I don't care how big the thing is, you're not going to get millions of species. People need to understand the difference between a species and kinds. And I do want to read a section here that was put in the material that is certainly above my pay grade when it comes to scientific knowledge. And so I want to read this from this particular material that was provided by those who are specializing in defending Christian evidences. How could millions of animal species fit on the ark? It's argued by many scientists there are over 10 million different animal species on the planet today. If there were at least 2 representatives of every species, and in some cases 7, Genesis 7, 2, and 3, how could the ark be large enough to house its passengers for an entire year, some of which were dinosaurs? Well, in truth, it's not certain that there are over 10 million species on the planet. The actual cataloged number of species as of 2018 was roughly 1.8 million. Biologists are projecting they will eventually catalog over 10 million, but even that number includes many species that would not have been on the ark, since the text does not list them among the animals Noah brought, including 5 of the 6 entire kingdoms. Many creatures found within Animalia would not have been represented on the ark because they were marine creatures, and many amphibians that could survive outside the ark, as well as many of the insects, since they do not have the breath of life, Genesis 7:15, and many would not be classified as creeping things based on Genesis 7:14. And so when you look at the kingdoms of life and what would have been needed to be aboard the ark, there's another thing to keep in mind. The text of Genesis indicates that kinds of creatures, not species, were brought on the ark. Those two terms are not the same. The designation species was developed in relatively recent times, thousands of years after Moses wrote. Kind is likely more closely related to the modern taxonomic terms of family or genus. Much of the diversity we see within these categories has come about due to the inheritable variation within the genomes of the proto-species on the ark. Representatives of the canines, for example, were on the ark from that one group, would develop over time with the various species and the various characteristics of the genus would come foxes, wolves, jackals, coyotes, dingoes, domesticated dogs. Bottom line, the number of species on the planet was likely on the order of thousands during the time of Noah, not millions. And skeptics say still, though, well, the ark, though, would not have been able to house even that many. And I think what's pointed out in this slide here is interesting. This tornado shelter is not designed for everyday habitation. The people who live inside this house have this tornado shelter available to them, but that's not where they live. You can fit the number of people that live inside this house inside this. This wasn't built to be bigger because it didn't need to be bigger. It's not going to be used on an everyday basis, hopefully never used very often. To avoid, tornadoes, it's good to have when you need it, but it's not intended to be a place of residency on an ongoing basis. And when it comes to the size of this ark, this is an actual picture of the ark there in Kentucky. And this picture here that you see, this is that same family of Brother Miller. Jeff Miller is the man who's mentioned here, along with his family. And you can see how tall this ark is compared to the size of the family. This is a monstrous seagoing vessel, more than capable of housing. Just get on board sometime and look around at how much space is available. And there's something else to consider that we need to include here, and that is that when you're talking about the cubit could vary in length. If you're using an 18-inch cubit, then these are your dimensions. But there's another cubit that was sometimes used. It was the 21-inch cubit. In that case, you're talking 525 feet long, 87 feet wide, 52 feet high. But friends, you don't even need that. There is a creation geologist and biologist by the name of John Woodmorappe, who conducted a thorough study of the feasibility of housing 16,000 animals that would be representative from each of the genus. Even more than would be represented if family rank is being used instead. And the ark, even using an 18-inch cubit and taking into account the special requirements for food, water, waste disposal, heating, ventilation, and lighting, and he found that even the 18-inch cubit would have been big enough to house that many animals. And as far as animal size, the hilarious thing is that some people would act like, oh, well, how do you get dinosaurs on there? Well, who in the world would ever say that Noah would have been required to find the biggest dinosaur on the planet and say, here, I'm getting you on the board right now? An elephant, 13 feet tall if it's an adult African elephant, weighs up to 14,000 pounds, can eat up to 600 pounds of food every day, can drink up to 50, 60 gallons of water every day. The 2-year-old version of this, 4 to 5 feet tall, weighs about 1,000 pounds, eats about 5% of its weight every day. Now, which one would you choose to take on board the ark? I think I know which one I'd choose. I'd choose the one that's smaller, that doesn't require as much time. By the way, this is a replica of a dinosaur egg. And there's nothing that would have required Noah, if I said Moses earlier, as long as I don't say Tarzan and Goliath tonight, I feel a little better. But if I said Moses, I meant Noah. Noah wasn't required to take dinosaurs aboard the ark that were of any size. He didn't have to find the Brontosaurus or the T-Rex. Someone says, wait a minute, you're acting like you believe dinosaurs are real. Come tomorrow night and we'll show you from God's Word that, yeah, they existed. It would be foolhardy to deny that they did. But that does not give place to or space to evolution. As a matter of fact, it does in no way, shape, or form countenance what the evolutionist would claim. Now, I'm going to, by way of invitation, use the application slide here. I just want to show it to you so that you'll have a point of reference when we come back to it during the invitation section tonight. We're talking about the ark, one boat. We're talking about the door, one door. We're talking about the water and how, according to 1 Peter 3, 20 to 21, those who were aboard the ark were saved by water. How were they saved by water? Because the water lifted up the ark they were in and separated it from the sinful world left behind. And that gave them separation from sin in that sense. And just like that, today we'll talk about what also now saves us. I will say this to you as we close before the youngins come our way. I want you to be able to hear this and really let this sink in. What if someone had come up to Noah and said, Noah, there's a rumor going around that you believe that only you and the people aboard that ark are going to be saved. Is that really what you believe? Do you really believe the only people who are going to be saved from the flood are you and the people aboard that ark? Is that what you believe, Noah? I want to ask you the question, what would the right answer to that question have been in Noah's day? Was there another way of salvation available that God just didn't tell Noah about? No. One location for salvation. And it would have been arrogant for Noah to get up and say, you know what? I think there are probably other ways, so why don't you just pray and ask God to spare you from the flood that way? Why don't you just say the flood prayer and be saved that way? No, no, no. When we come back to the invitation, we'll talk about that and flesh it out and give you God's invitation.
Thank you for joining us tonight, especially those of you on social media. We encourage you to tune in again tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock as we continue this study of the flood.